Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Sherlock Conversations. It has been a while since I've actually recorded an interview related to Sherlock. I've been spending a lot of time on Facebook. I've kind of stayed away from the WordPress site just because of a whole bunch of personal things that have been going on in my life. My wife and I have relocated to the beautiful, beautiful state of Pennsylvania. And I got to tell you, the more I keep finding out about Pennsylvania, the more I think, wow, what an absolutely amazing state, and has some of the most amazing people in it. And of all things that I have found a wonderful resident of Pennsylvania, a writer by the name of Randy Williams, who has written probably one of the most unique Sherlock Holmes pastiches ever. And we are thrilled to have an interview. We're thrilled to interview him today. And to be honest with you, full candor, I started back doing the interviews again so that I had an excuse to talk to Randy, because I was so amazed by his book and so amazed by his story. I had to start this back up again. So Randy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here, man, and thanks for all those kind words. I'll pay you later.
Nice. Now, before you say anything, let me just read a little bit about what the pastiche is about. It is called Sherlock Holmes and the Autumn of Terror. The year 2017 opens when a sealed box of Sherlock Holmes's most controversial cases are given to Dr. John Watson's great-grandson, Jacob, and among those cases is that of London's Ripper murders that took place in what was then and has forever been known as the Autumn of Terror. Jacob is shocked to learn the true story, as well as the reasons Holmes deemed the case's explosive revolution too shocking and incendiary to have been revealed to the public in Victoria, England, and so to be sealed, entombed in a tin box for 125 years, as were a number of other cases that were mentioned in some of Arthur Conan Doyle's Holmes stories. Along the way, the actual facts of the case and the evidence that led Randy Williams and his team of real life and led his team, misread that, and is led Randy Williams and his team of investigators to the real killers behind Jack the Ripper. Randy, this is a big order. You found the world. You and your pretty heavy criminal investigators. You worked with Dr. Michael Baden, Dr. Cyril Wecht, and Dr. Henry Lee. And Henry Lee should be familiar to Sherlock Holmes fans because he was also involved in How Sherlock Holmes Saved the World, the documentary that appeared on PBS. You've got some heavy hitters working with you.
Yes, I do. I'm very, very proud of that fact. These guys are three of the world's top, not just America's top, the world's top forensic scientists, criminalists, very well known. They've all been involved in a lot of very high profile cases, from John F. Kennedy's assassination, Robert F. Kennedy, Marilyn Monroe, Elvis Presley, Bruce Lee, any and everybody. Dr. Baden recently was the forensic pathologist behind the revelation in the Michael Brown case, the hands up, don't shoot. That changed the face of that whole case. Doctors Lee, Wecht, and Baden had their own part in the John Benet Ramsey investigation, and more recently, Dr. Lee was featured on a special with a panel of experts that came up with another solution to the John Benet Ramsey mystery. Dr. Lee, by the way, just suffered the loss of his beloved wife, which is
yeah. So, if I may interrupt you with that, I happen to be a person of faith, and I have no problem asking people to pray for people in their time of need. So it wouldn't be a bad idea if you are a person that prays, send one up to Dr. Henry Lee and his family. That was really sad.
Well, that's very kind of you to do that, Don. Dr. Lee was personally responsible for the safe recovery of Elizabeth Smart. You'll remember her as the kidnapped victim in Utah that was held for quite a long time. It was Dr. Lee's investigative expertise that led to the apprehension of her captor and her safe release. and she is to this very day in touch with Dr. Lee constantly to keep him updated on all the developments in her life, like her recent marriage. And she is just probably the world's second greatest fan of Dr. Lee, right behind me.
I can imagine, for personal reasons there. Holy cow. That's really awesome. So you've surrounded yourself with all of these guys, and I'm gonna just jump right into this. The cover. I wanted to talk real quick about the cover of your book, The Autumn of Terror. The photo that you used.
There's a story behind that. Yeah.
It is oh rats, there I had a name for that. It was called the A Suspicious Character, and it appeared in the Illustrated London News, October 13th, 1888, with folks associated with the Vigilance Committee. And what's amazing about this cover is Sherlock came out the year before in 1887, and it looks like somebody just purposely drew in Watson and Sherlock Holmes. It like just eyeing this really suspicious looking guy in a big hat and a real thick coat, who it's implied that he's Jack the Ripper. And this was in the illustrated newspaper. Supposedly, this would be like the typical newspaper that a Londoner would have had at that time, and that's the picture. So it's almost like this undercurrent of, we really wish Sherlock would step out of the Arthur Conan Doyle books and solve this case.
Now, if your viewers or listeners rather are really good detectives, they'll take a look at that picture on the cover, and they'll notice a very subtle difference between the original newspaper illustration and the cover of my book. Do you know what that is yet?
I'm going to look at your book right now. I was looking at the illustration there, and
if you pull up the original, you may or may not notice a difference. Depends on how observant you are. But there is a unique difference.
That is what. Okay, I am calling up the cover of your book right now so I can see the difference between that. And by the way, your book is so awesome, I bought it twice so that I could have it on different devices, just because it was that good.
That is very kind of you.
So oh rats, I can't see the, oh wait, now I can see the, yes, there is a subtle difference where the face of the man in the original drawing is looking over his shoulder like, all right, any moment now these guys are gonna come and get me. The cover of your book has the gentleman looking forward.
Yep, and very observant, Don. The difference is I've substituted an artist's rendering of my actual suspect for the killings for that made-up face that they chose to portray Jack the Ripper back in 1888. Other than that, it's all the same.
Yeah, but you got to admit, though, it was almost as if your book was written to have an excuse to have that picture as the cover. That's just awesome.
I agree. You know, and I'm sure other people have noticed that, you know, just as you did. And I've seen that picture used times, and even on some other Jack the Ripper books, to my knowledge, as associated with Sherlock Holmes. I'm sure others have noticed that similarity, but it struck me right away. But rather than the face that they had chosen to portray, sort of generic opinion of what Jack the Ripper might have looked like, I actually put in the face of the real Ripper.
Right, right.
Randy, one of the things I find really hilarious about the whole Sherlock pastiche thing is how people come up with the lost stories that Watson actually wrote down, and then they either get put in a safety deposit box or they get found someplace. How did you come up with your...
It's mentioned in the original stories that Watson put away, you know, in a tin box, you know, all the cases that were deemed too incendiary or too controversial that could affect people that's still living that were innocent. So that is part of the original canon. Right.
Every so often, though, you hear somebody do something a little bit different with it, where you hear people say, like, oh, yeah, it turned out that this was a friend of Mrs. Hudson's that gave this manuscript that got passed down, that type of thing. So I always find that interesting to see people doing stuff like that.
You know, that was a little bit of an obstacle for me to hurdle. because I had to figure out how I was going to make this happen, because I wanted to introduce the book in the modern day. So in order to do that, I had to create a fictional great-grandson for Watson, and therefore the whole birth of his son occurring 9 months after the capture of the Rippers in my book.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a little backstory to that too, which probably don't want to know, but it was a challenge because we had to do that. I had to figure out a way to bring it out and kind of grab the reader. And and it's been done, I'm sure, many times over, as you mentioned. And I try to think of a new way to approach it. And I know that real Sherlock aficionados are going to immediately jump on me because Watson never had a son. We know that. But there's a little something called suspension of disbelief.
Yes.
And I hope that everybody would sort of allow me that little bit of journalistic freedom to be able to bring it to you in a way that would sort of explain how it would all come out in 2017.
Right. Now, one of the things that, to kind of go into the writing of the book, and then we can kind of stem back and forth and kind of hopscotch from Sherlock to Jack the Ripper and so forth. When you wrote the book, you did it from the perspective of not just Watson. It actually reminded me of the structure of Dracula to some extent, where you've got multiple narrators that do it in certain different ways. Like, again, like how Dr. Seward is recording it on a phonograph, Nina Harker's typing on a typewriter, Jonathan Harker is doing it in his journal. Did you sit down and have to, more or less, how hard was it to plot this out? Because once you, actually, you know what, let's just go back a little bit further. What came first with this? Was it Jack the Ripper or Sherlock Holmes?
Oh, it was definitely Jack the Ripper. I would never purport to write a book offering a solution to a case of any sort without having ironclad evidence against my suspect. That's one of my pet peeves. There's certain authors that have just dragged these guys' names through the mud with little or no, well, I'm going to say no evidence, because you know why? Because they didn't do it. So there is no evidence. You don't have evidence against a person who didn't do it.
Right.
So, I really, really am strongly against that sort of thing. And so I had an ironclad case built against my suspects, plural, before I even dreamed of writing a book. Right. The Sherlock came up naturally because I met with my 3 co-authors, and during the meeting, we started discussing, well, how is this going to be written? And it was already a foregone conclusion that I was going to be the writer, because I had written books before. All of them had as well, but none of them really was prepared to take on. They're too busy to take on this project.
Right. So
it was going to be me, and so what I did was, we were kicking around some ideas, and all the doctors agreed. Listen, this isn't a money-making thing. You're not going to make money off this.
Right.
So what we want to do is try to get this theory out to as many people as we can, and we know from our own personal experience that if we write this as a very dry clinical criminologist point of view of the case, you're only going to get it out to a certain number of people that are hardcore, cut and dried criminology fans, true crime. So we have to think of a hook that is going to get more people involved, that is going to and give you a sort of a vehicle to get this theory out to more people, because it's very important to all of us that this theory gets out there.
Right.
So how are we going to do that? And I thought, well, I knew from experience with these 3 doctors that they're all big Sherlock Holmes fans. As you mentioned earlier,
right.
Dr. was featured in How Sherlock Holmes Changed the World. And so, I knew he was a huge fan. He actually gave a symposium on Sherlock Holmes and criminalistics probably a couple of years ago now, which I attended. And so
wow.
I knew that he was a huge fan of Sherlock Holmes. And I had remembered seeing a photo that you may have seen. It's in my book. It's on
yes.
Of the 3 doctors dressed up like Sherlock Holmes with the deerstalkers and the cloaks.
Right.
And the pipes, the calabash. And so I thought, well, let me just bring that up. So at the meeting, I said, well, what do you think, docs? What do you think if I did this as a Sherlock Holmes solves the case? And we walked the reader through what we did. And everybody said, well, that sounds like a great idea. And I said, well, I know there have been a couple of movies at least, and probably a couple of books that I didn't know about at the time, I've found out about since, that have done just that. And so I didn't know that at the time. So I said, well, let's, what do you guys think of that? And they all said, well, Dr. Wecht said, I've been a Sherlock Holmes fan since I was, so small. My mom used to come in my bedroom and I would hide under the blanket with a flashlight and read my Sherlock Holmes novels, so she would catch me. And Dr. Baden had a similar story, and Dr. Lee is a huge fan of Sherlock Holmes, as I mentioned before, and you probably know from watching that special.
Right, yeah. He actually credits Sherlock as being the big reason why he became the criminalist, the criminal investigator that he does.
As do all four of us. Every one of us became investigators and criminalists because of Sherlock Holmes. Every one of us.
Right.
So it was kind of a no-brainer to choose Sherlock Holmes, and also because of evidence we may speak about in this interview that links Sherlock Holmes in a way to the Ripper murders. And so it was kind of a no-brainer for me to suggest that, and when I did, it was a unanimous, resounding yes, let's do it that way. So that's where it came from.
Right. Now, so kind of like we've already stepped up, like you've already discussed the process of how you've figured out the Jack the Ripper murders, and again, Steph Young, who I'm going to have a link to, did a wonderful interview with you about that, and you walked through the whole way of how you came up with it and what your source was, and your method of that, how you filtered it down from something like 700 people down to 5, and then you got rid of 2, and then you investigated the 3 of them, and you went, oh wow, okay, so you've got who you believe is the as you said, the parties behind the Jack the Ripper murders.
Right. I call them the unholy trinity, or the sons of anarchy.
Right. So when you decided that you were going to put this in a story and you were putting it in a Sherlock, everyone knew, obviously, that most Sherlock stories are told from Watson's perspective. Yet you had so much information, you knew you couldn't do this like Watson's perspective, and we had to go back, and again, citing the example of Dracula as an epistolary novel, how did you sit down for like you must have sat down for several days or weeks or months and said, okay, we're going to put this in chapter 1, chapter 2 is going to have this, chapter 3 will be told from the perspective of the killer, chapter 4, and so forth. Did you sit down and map that out as how you did that?
Yeah, absolutely did. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I had to take into consideration, as you said, Watson couldn't possibly know certain details.
Right.
So I thought the reader needs to be clued in on certain details in order to follow along, and if they're a good detective, figure it out along the way. So I had to insert various chapters in between Watson's narrative, and I had to be very mindful of the fact that Watson couldn't know this, did know that. And I even did a whole chapter from Sherlock Holmes's point of view, in the manner of the adventure of the Blanche soldier, where he,
right,
one of the times when Sherlock actually narrates. And what I had to do was figure out what information Watson was privy to, what he wasn't. And so I did some chapters from the viewpoint of the omniscient narrator. So I've got, and they're done in a different typeface if you pay attention in my book.
Yeah.
The typeface, if it's the modern Times Roman, that's done from the omniscient narrator who knows all but doesn't tell you everything.
Right.
Then, for example, I did the murders the first time around from his point of view. And then later on, the murders are redone from the murderer's point of view, with all of those little details filled in that an astute reader would have caught in the first reading and said, wait a minute, how did one guy do this and that at the same time? Or wait a minute, that doesn't make sense because he was just there. How was he there? See? And then what I did was I redid the murders from the murderer's point of view, so that I could fill in those blanks for the astute reader. Now, I've been criticized on Amazon for doing that. It's repetitive and boring. And I thought, well, you missed the point, because repetitive I'd have to agree with, but boring, maybe not. I hope not, because in these details, for example, like in the earlier chapters will be like the man jumped down from the, and then in the later or the young man did this, the man did that, the young man did that,
right.
And then later on it's I did this while so and so did that. Well, I guess it's going to be anybody who hears Steph Young's interview is going to know who my suspects are. So,
right.
I mean, spoiler alert, okay?
Right.
Right. So I did that. Then I did one whole chapter from Sherlock Holmes's point of view, and I did that, like the Blanche Soldier. What I tried to do there was give a story within a story. So it's called the Bogus Laundry Affair, and Sherlock Holmes fans will know that Conan Doyle mentions the Bogus Laundry Affair as one of those cases that was locked up in a tin box, entombed in a tin box,
right,
stored at Cox and Company in Charing Cross. And so people will know that story supposedly existed but was never written. Well, what I did was I wrote the Bogus Laundry Affair with nothing but the bare details. The D.I. Aldrich, who was swarthy guy, and just the bare essentials of the cardboard of the Bogus Laundry Affair. And I wrote that story as a story within a story, so the reader could go straight to that chapter and read that, and then say, well, I don't like this guy's writing, and then throw the book away. Or they might say, I like this guy's writing, and read the book. They could read it when it appears, which is what I prefer, because it's supposed to be a little bit of a diversion.
Right.
Because you get a whole bunch of clues just before it, and I'm thinking, oh, they're going to bust me, so let me divert their attention with this other thing. So the Bogus Laundry Affair is a total story within a story. It could be read separately. It doesn't have any spoilers in it. You could read it first. You could read it later. Don't read it at all. It has no bearing on the rest of the book.
Right.
We have a chapter from Holmes's point of view. We also have a chapter from Diemschutz's point of view, more than one. We've got a couple chapters from Kozabrodsky's point of view, and we have a couple chapters from Samuel Friedman's point of view.
Right. Now I got to say this, and I was looking up the names real quick. Two of my favorite writers are a gentleman by the name of Lincoln Child and Douglas Preston, and they wrote a series of books about a special agent named Aloysius Pendergast, who, if you read any of the books, you just can see Holmes' fingerprints and influence all over that. And finally, in the book, I believe it was called White Fire. That's what I was trying to look up. Their last several titles have had some sort of color theme to it. But White Fire, it's set in Colorado, and there is a huge Sherlock Holmes subplot to it. And they actually had a lost manuscript of Sherlock Holmes.
Oh, wait, I think I've heard that one before.
Yeah.
Okay, go on.
And I was going to say, it is a story within a story. Like, they could literally pull out the Sherlock Holmes chapter and put it on Amazon, self-publish it themselves as a story, as a Sherlock Holmes story on its own. So you could almost do something like that with your chapter, with your Sherlock.
Well, I submitted it to the Strand magazine, but they told me to, they didn't want it.
Oh, okay. That happens. The Strand magazine gets like thousands of Sherlock Holmes stories.
They might look at me again now, though. Now that I'm, now that the book's #1 in a bunch of categories.
Yeah, because you mentioned that it's like #1 in a bunch of Jack the Ripper categories.
Mm-hmm. And Sherlock Holmes categories, and serial killers, and historical mysteries, and detective fiction, and historical. It's doing really well, thanks to all the readers, and thank you all very much, those of you that are listening. You don't know how much I appreciate it.
When you came up with the book, I mean, like, I'm going to say what's really funny about it is that one of the biggest reasons why I started the Sherlock Conversations, and I will say this until I am like 6 months after I've been in the ground, was because of the writing of Lindsay Fay. and she had written a book called Dust and Shadow, which is a fictional take on Sherlock Holmes and Jack the Ripper, and she has a single suspect, and very well written book, and just a lot
Who's her
of fun.
suspect? Who's her suspect?
She made up the suspect.
All right.
Yeah, she made up the suspect that would have fit everything in that, and she made up the suspect. It was very well written, and she also wrote another series of books that actually came out called The Whole Art of Detection. That was a collection of Sherlock Holmes short stories that are now in a book, and one of my favorite Sherlock Holmes actually is Christopher Plummer in Murder by Decree, which is also
A Ripper story.
yeah, a Jack the Ripper story. So it's all funny how you have all of these different Jack the Ripper stories and Sherlock Holmes meets Jack the Ripper type of stories. Were you ever intimidated by that? But like you're like,
Sure, of course. Who wouldn't be? You'd be crazy not to be.
right.
I mean, it's a monumental task, Don, to try to match the quality of writing, the pacing, everything that goes with an Arthur Conan Doyle story, even if it's not a Sherlock story. I mean, his ghost stories, his medical ghost stories, you name it, even Uncle Bernac, his war stories,
Right.
anything like that. To try to match anything he's written is, you're in awe of the man, and you're humbled by his greatness. And so, if you went in there, thinking that this was going to be something easy and that you could easily or even outdo him, that'd be the equivalent of a martial artist saying, well, let me just write something better than anything Bruce Lee ever did on the martial arts.
Yeah.
So yes, very intimidating. So here's what I did. Oh, that was my martini glass.
That's okay.
So what I did was this, and people, the Sherlock Holmes fans, any of your listeners that actually pick up my book, you're going to see a bunch of stuff you recognize. Because here's what I did. I went through, I bought some really old, beat up copies of the works of Doyle in England. And I read every single Sherlock Holmes story, as well as some other works. And I would underline little phrases, words and phrases that I thought this captures the flavor of the time.
Right.
And then what I would do is I then, after I finished everything, I went and I transcribed all of these little words and phrases into a Word file. And then as I wrote my book, I picked and chose those phrases that would be appropriate for what I was trying to get across, so that, so as to use Doyle-esque language.
Right.
And so that was, let me tell you, nothing less than a monumental task.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you this, you're not the first person to tell me that. I had one Sherlock Holmes pastiche writer tell me that as they wrote their book, they actually had the original canon open in another window document, and they would constantly go back and forth to make sure, does this sound like it? Does that sound like it?
That's probably a smart way to do it too. I did it a little different.
Right.
I've been somewhat successful. I've had a couple of reviewers say that I captured it, pretty authentically. So I'm hoping to have done a good job. And I don't purport to be any great master of writing. This is my first work of fiction.
Right.
And, the main objective wasn't to try to please Sherlock Holmes aficionados. I'm sure they're all going to nitpick and have their, grievances with what I've written, and righteously so. And I understand that.
Right.
What I was trying to do was, I was trying to bring people that had never been interested in the Ripper case, but were interested in Holmes, into that case.
Right.
And I was trying to bring people that were interested in the Ripper case, but are kind of burned out on reading everything that's out there. I tried to bring something into it a little different. So I was trying to bring together a couple of different groups of readers, and I thought we all thought Holmes was a great vehicle to do it, and I still think that it was, and I think that the figures are bearing it out now, that we have got a lot of people interested in the Ripper case that weren't before. Right. And we've got some Ripper people that like the book as well. So I'm pretty happy with that. But let me just say to your listeners, because I'm sure that they're more Holmes guys and girls than than Ripper people, Ripperologists they're called. And probably most of them are Holmes people first, and some of them are probably Ripperologists as well, because they kind of go hand in hand.
Right.
As it did with myself and the doctors. But I would never purport to match Arthur Conan Doyle in any way, shape, or form, and I'm sure there are flaws, in my methods. But I did do my best to do him honor, and I also paid tribute to him in a couple of ways that you may have seen in the book. For one thing, there's this sort of this wandering war injury of Dr. Watson.
Right.
That is constantly brought up by naysayers, that Doyle was getting senile, because in this story he mentions that Watson's shoulder hurts, and in this story he mentions he's limping. So which is it? Doyle, was losing it. Well, no, he wasn't, because according to Dr. Lee, arguably the world's leading expert on bullet wounds and their implications, we spent the whole afternoon figuring out how Watson could have received a wound with one Giselle bullet that would have damaged not only his arm but his leg, shoulder and leg. And we figured out the position that he could have been in order for that to have happened. And there's a whole chapter in there where Watson has this horrific dream after a very deadly one-on-one fight, and he has this horrific dream bringing him back to Kandahar, and he's squatting and pointing in a certain way that Dr. Lee suggested to me was one possibility, and he receives one Giselle bullet wound, which does the damage to not only the acromion of his shoulder, but to his leg as well.
Right.
So I paid a little tribute to Doyle in that way by sort of saying, put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Nice.
And put that in your calabash. And I also paid tribute to Doyle in another way, because there's the other pesky issue of the Ely's cartridge, Ely's weapon. If you've, well, I know you have, but if some of the listeners have read closely, you'll see that there's this sort of dichotomy where Holmes seems to think that Ely's is the weapon that Watson uses. And I think Doyle did that on purpose, because I think that Doyle intended for Holmes to not be an expert on weaponry, just as he's not an expert on gardening, even though he knows all about poisons. And he's not an expert on astronomy, even though in my book he becomes one. So I think that Doyle maybe purposely wanted that character flaw in Holmes, but the naysayers will point out, there's this mistake about the Ely's Ely's were cartridges or bullets, and Holmes names the weapon in Ely's.
Right.
Whereas, in my book, he's corrected by Lestrade, who says, you got this one wrong, Holmes. I know, because I'm a marksman, I know that Ely's is a cartridge and they don't make weapons. The weapon you're talking about is a Webley British Bulldog. And Holmes looks at the weapon and sees the British Bulldog, the Webley's logo stamped into it, and says, well, you're right this time, Lestrade. And when Lestrade lights up, he says, but, don't be too proud of yourself, because even a broken clock is right twice a day.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, because that's one of the things that's so fun about, like, when people know about Sherlock Holmes, they know him as somebody who never gets anything wrong.
Well, they think he never gets anything wrong.
Right. Well, I mean, public perception is he never gets anything wrong. That's what I meant. As opposed to, but when you read the books, I mean, like, heck, the case of the mystery of the yellow face, that's a perfect example of that.
Right. That's mentioned in my book as well, that case.
Yeah, because one of the things that I like that you did with your book is you stretched it over the Holmes and Watson timeline. Because at one point in time, Watson says, well, while this was going on, we were dealing with the Hound of the Baskervilles. And then you bring up, like, oh yeah, Mary and I had my son. You remember Mary? We mentioned her in Sign of the Four. You seem like you really went to a lot of trouble to.
Oh yeah, I did it all chronologically. So I knew that in this time in 1889, this would have been going on with Watson, or this case would have been going on based on the canon. And his son being born when he is, he mentions that Jacob Watson the first, and he goes, I don't really know. I met her during the case of the sign of four. I don't really know what four means. And later on, of course, Jacob Watson the fourth is the one who opens the box.
Right.
He's the four of the sign of four.
Right. That's really cool. Now, one of the other things is that I wanted to ask, you've written your first Sherlock book, and I know that you've talked about you're working on a second version of your Ripper book, but it's more of a straightforward. Hi,
Yeah, no
here's.
no Holmes.
I'm sorry.
No Holmes.
No Holmes. Yeah, it's a straightforward. Hi, this is who did it. This is how it happened. Da 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 da. Would you consider doing another Holmes story?
I would, if enough people like yourself, people that are really into the Holmes canon, expressed that they really like my work and wanted me to. If I got, some of the people that are kind of well known in the community as being Holmes experts, if they turned around and said, this guy did a pretty good job and we'd like to see more from him, I certainly would think about writing one of the other cases. I might write, maybe the case of Vigo the Hammersmith Wonder, or the Camberwell poisoning, where the depth of the parsley in the butter, you know what I'm talking about. Or
Right.
All these cases. There's a number of them. The Sumatra.
Yeah, the giant rat of Sumatra.
And I would, because I would love to do that. And I think I don't know. I think I'm capable, but time will tell whether the real Holmes aficionados will deem me worthy or not.
Right.
Like Anthony Horowitz, who I consulted with Anthony Horowitz before I ever wrote this, and he gave me some really great advice. And of course, everybody, including the estate of Arthur Conan Doyle, gives the stamp of approval to Horowitz to carry on Doyle. I would never, ever put myself in the same category as a Horowitz. But if enough people like work and wanted me to do it, I would.
Right. That would be cool. I mean, would you ever consider coming up with your when people read about your background? I mean, you have come from a private security. You work in law enforcement right now. I'm not going to go too far into this, but you had mentioned that you have done bodyguard work, and you're from Los Angeles, and you have a very, very strong background in martial arts, and you've written several books about martial arts. Would you consider writing one from scratch type of thing, or with all of your experiences saying, this case that occurred here, this would make for a great Sherlock Holmes. I'll change the names, change this and this, and just do one that's not 600 pages long or something like that. Because most Holmes stories the short stories are 8 to 10,000 words. Would you consider doing something like that?
To answer your question, Don, I've already done that. If you want to talk about a short story, earlier, before the book came out, there's a really lovely website out of England called the English Informer in the UK, and they also have the English Informer in France. And it was designed originally for expatriate Englishmen and women to feel like they're at home a little bit, living overseas, and read about their home country. And it got expanded to include the UK now, so the English Informer. And they basically serialized my novel in the same way that the Strand and serialized the Sherlock Holmes stuff.
Nice.
And so they did my whole book, chapter by chapter. Every week was a new chapter, and it finished probably 2 months ago. And but they had a special Christmas issue, which reminded me of the Beatons' Christmas annual, and the English Informer website asked me would I like to write a Christmas story, and I did. I wrote them a little Christmas story featuring Holmes and Watson, and that was published on the English Informer, and got some decent feedback, and I was pretty pleased with it. And so to answer your question, I've done it already, and I would be more than happy to do it again if enough people thought that I was worthy of it. I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Wow. Well, when you have the opportunity to make that available, send me a link to it so that we can share that with our listeners and readers as well.
Sure.
So That is really cool. Now, let's kind of go back to the Jack the Ripper murders and everything, and that is really a horrific story. Anybody reading up on it? I've now I will admit I'm not a ripperologist. I am, for lack of a better term, about as armchair quarterback as can be. And the books that I've come across, the one book that I had really come across that kind of gave me an interest in Jack the Ripper was I'm going to say Patricia Cornwell's Portrait of an Artist, or Portrait of a Killer. And a lot of ripperologists, I would say probably about three-fourths of the community, have ripped that book apart, no pun intended.
Every possible pun intended.
Yeah. And have said that,
well, there's no evidence. There's no
right.
evidence.
But the thing that I liked about it, that I had not seen anybody else done up until that day, was they had treated it, or at least this was my first encounter with it, that they had treated it as if it were she treated it as if it were a crime. And this is like post CSI, when everybody was getting
as if it were a crime.
She treated it as if it were like a modern day kind of like a BTK killer type of thing. She treated it like that. Up until then, Jack the Ripper to me had been something borderline romantic. I mean, you yourself have talked about how people are dressed like Jack the Ripper at Halloween and not treated it that there are real victims here that were just brutally, literally destroyed. And that was one of the things that I liked about that. And when I read your book, or read up on your book and everything that was involved with that, I felt that you had brought the same respect to what was happening with Jack the Ripper. Like, to me, it seemed like people wanted to solve Jack the Ripper almost like armchair quarterbacks. Like, whereas, you got people watching football saying, oh, I would have put this guy in the game, taken that guy out better than the coach would have done. And it seemed like that there are armchair ripperologists.
Oh yeah, there's plenty of those.
Yeah, that are kind of like, well, that's not who I think who did it. And then after a while, it seemed that the thing was, they treated Jack the Ripper almost as something like he is the real life incarnation of a Sherlock Holmes, Dracula, who was popular at that time. This was the real world extension of that, and there was something sexy. And did Jack the Ripper move into the apartment downstairs in a house that my grandmother may have owned, or something along those lines?
Right. Or the latest TV series where he's this really super handsome young guy with perfect teeth who manages to get an apartment, a top-notch apartment in Manhattan his first week back in modern day.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like he's treated like that. And what I did like about Cornwell's book, and to the same extent what I like about your book, is I really did get the feeling of, we want to bring justice to these victims.
Well, that's the ultimate goal, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, you've pulled them from being something sexy and, ooh, is somebody going to sneak into my house at midnight and take control of me, versus, no, these were poor women that really deserve to have justice just because of what they did, or just because of who they were,
or in spite of what they did.
Yeah, in spite of that. And it seems like that you brought that mentality with your book.
Well, I should have, because it is my mindset. I mean, it doesn't matter to me that they were unfortunate, what they used to call prostitutes back then. These women weren't prostitutes by choice. They were prostitutes because they had to be, because of the times, the poverty, the inaccessibility of health care and work. They had to do what they did. They did it to feed their families. They did it to feed themselves. They didn't do it because they were some kind of nymphomaniac and enjoyed the work. And I have a lot of sympathy for those victims, and I want to do them justice. They deserve justice, and I think they'll have it at some point.
Right. Now, you basically explained that the murders were politically motivated. Am I correct?
Very, very much so. They were the same motivation behind these murders as you see today. Watch the news, today or tomorrow. They were motivated by race, religion, and politics, not necessarily in that order.
Right. But I will say this, though, kind of when I think politically motivated murders, I think of something along the lines of Lee Harvey Oswald, not Lee Harvey Oswald, John Wilkes Booth, the gentleman that shot McKinley. I shouldn't say gentleman, but the guy that shot McKinley. Those are straightforward. I'm just going to walk up to you, pull a gun, and shoot you in the back of the head, shooting you in the face. Whereas the last official Jack the Ripper murder, I want to make sure I get her name right.
Mary Kelly.
Yeah, Mary Kelly. That was a sociopath buffet, was what that was. I mean, it was like someone gutted her and just.
Well, they were sending a message. Here's what they did. There was a political motivation, but a specific agent was sent into England from Russia to head up this organization, which was the International Working Men's Educational Club, which was not an educational club.
Educational, as you always say.
Yeah, it was an anarchist, socialist, communist club, and this guy was probably not what we would consider a psychopath or sociopath by today's standards. But what he did was he recruited a couple of guys that he knew were perfect for the job. So he did get a psychopath, a very young kid, to do the dirtiest of what I call the wet work. And he also recruited another very brutal henchman to be the muscle. And in my book, Holmes sums it up very neatly by saying, this was a three-headed snake. One was the brains, one was the venom, and one was the muscle. And I have a sneaking suspicion this might be a two-headed snake. And that would be referring to Prince Kropotkin, who I believe organized and funded the whole thing.
Right. So basically, this guy knew how to go out there and find, because basically what you got, it boils down to, and I was talking about this with someone the other day, and we were going back and forth, and I was saying something like how if you, like almost something mafioso, where if you have a head of a crime family, and they don't like the other crime families that are across town, they'll say like, hey, Vinny the Knuckle, go over there and kill this guy or something like that. It's usually a straightforward shoot the guy in the head, throw the guy in the back of the trunk. So what you're basically saying is that
oh no, this was much more involved in all that.
Right, was that somebody knew that guy over there has a Jeffrey Dahmer quality to him. That guy over there has a Charles Manson, John Wayne Gacy type of quality to him. He would be perfect for what needs to be done. So you're saying that he knew somebody like that, hired him and said, hey, how would you like to go? I'll give you money. Go take out these women for this specific reason.
Well, sure, because he was the president or steward of said club.
Right.
So if you look at, for example, like unions in the past, not saying today, but in the past, a lot of times the union steward would be kind of a bully, and he'd surround himself with a bunch of guys that were kind of big, scary guys. And there was a little bit of an intimidation factor, not only towards the management, but towards other union members. And I think that Diemschutz personifies that. I think he surrounded himself with a couple of guys that he met in his dealings with the men's club that had particularly strong views politically, that or that were just violent in nature. Remember, one of my suspects had a rape conviction 2 years before the Ripper killings. Or he saw a quality, maybe a twisted quality in the young guy, and he molded him into a psychopath. I think he already probably had those, well, he would have had those tendencies, but may have never come to fruition had he not been influenced by Diemschutz to do what he was told and probably paid to do.
Right. That's sick and just awful. And again, also one of the things I wanted to reiterate was your next goal, if you have the opportunity, is to find out what happened to the three parties behind the Jack the Ripper murders, is to find out what ultimately happened with them.
Next trip to London, and that might involve a trip to Russia, or Poland or somewhere else, would be to find out, because I know that Deemschutz was told to return to Russia by Prince Kropotkin when he appeared at the men's club 6 months after the last murder. Or actually, I think it was 4 months. And I believe that he went back to Russia on Kropotkin's instructions. Basically, it's getting too hot here, your mission's accomplished, get back out of here. And I mentioned in the Steph Young interview that I wouldn't be at all surprised to hear that Samuel Friedman hung himself 2 years after the murders, or 2 months after the murders, and it was never even taken into consideration. It was just, he was just a footnote. And Jewish tailor kills himself over loss of business. And I wouldn't be surprised to find out that Isaac Kozubrotsky was killed in a tragic horse and buggy accident or something, because that would have been loose ends, and I don't think it would have been very Deemschutz of him to leave those two loose ends.
I see what you mean. But okay, yeah, I didn't, because when I first heard you mention that in the interview, I went, oh, so these poor guys suffer tragedies, but in reality, it's
no, I think it would have been orchestrated.
Yeah, that's okay. That was the implication there. Gotcha. Wow, I was a little bit slow on that. Yeah, so it wouldn't be like, oh wow, okay, so this poor guy hung himself. Sure he did. And then this other guy kind of accidentally tripped and fell and landed in the river. He just happened to have a bunch of rocks.
That's kind of what I'm thinking, because those guys were just footnotes. They weren't even considered important enough to testify in court or anything like that back in the day. Nobody even slightly suspected them. So I think that if they did meet a tragic end, it would have been, probably wouldn't even been featured in the newspaper, or if it was, it would have been just, Taylor dies in tragic sewing machine accident,
Yeah.
And that would have been that. But I don't think, as orchestrated as this whole operation was, I don't think they would have left them as loose ends. So I think that either they returned to Russia with Deemschutz, promised a life of luxury and maybe lived that out, or met some kind of tragic end.
Right, because I would think that the same thing would happen to... What this almost reminds me of is the opening scene from The Dark Knight, the Batman movie with Heath Ledger playing the Joker, and it was one guy shoots the other guy, who shoots the next guy, who shoots the next guy. So based on what you're talking about, if you said that a prince was responsible for sending Deemschutz, what was to stop Deemschutz from meeting the same fate?
Right, and he may well have, he may well have. So I don't know, but I'm going to find out. That's my next mission in life, because I think if I found that out, it's only going to go to strengthen my case. Because every time I look into some new aspect, I find something new that incriminates these guys. Right. No matter how hard I look, I can't find anything to exonerate them, and I've tried.
Right.
But every time I look up a new alley trying to exonerate them, I just find more stuff against them. Right. You know why? Because they did it. Because they're guilty. So the evidence is there. There's no such thing as a perfect crime.
Right.
People are always saying, well, no one will ever know, no one will ever find. No, that's not true. There's no such thing as a perfect crime. You just aren't looking in the right place. And when you do, you find the evidence. It's there.
Right. Well, let's just kind of, granted, let's kind of jump the gun just a little bit. Let's just say, for argument's sake, you write the current Ripper book, you finish it, you put that out. You then write an update to that book where you find out what happened to the 3 men that were responsible for the murders, Deemschutz, Friedman, and what was the name of the other guy?
Kozubrotsky. But that would go in the true crime version. But yeah, go on.
Okay. What else would you want to attack? Would you go after, say, the Lizzie Borden murders? Would you go after?
No, that's probably been beaten to death. Every possible pun intended. Right. But I think the next thing I've mentioned in a couple of interviews before that I'd like to go into is the death of Bruce Lee. Why? Well, being a martial artist, having learned from his top students in my lifetime, I was fortunate enough to learn from Sifu Ted Wong and Sifu Daniel Lee, 2 of Bruce Lee's top students.
Right.
I used to work for Bruce Lee's wife when I was a kid, by a fluke, and met her way back in the day when I was just a kid in the 70s. I would love to go to work on Bruce Lee's, the mystery of Bruce Lee's death. That would be probably my next case I want to tackle. There are people that want me to look at the Zodiac. There are people that want me to look at Lizzie Borden, as you mentioned. and there's a number of other cold cases out there, but where my interest really lies, I have to, to do this kind of a project and suffer the slings of arrows of the critics. I really have to have a passion for the case.
Right.
And the only one that I have that kind of passion for would probably be the mysterious death of Bruce Lee.
There was something else I wanted to talk about in regards to this, that I think other people just need to hear this type of uplifting message. And when I'm talking about uplifting, I'm talking about somebody that has set their mind to do something, and then they keep pushing on, keep pushing forward. Can you talk to me about the importance of having perseverance in a project like this? Were there ever times you wanted to just go, you know what, dang the whole thing, I'm going to go do something else with my time?
Well, perseverance is a huge factor in any great undertaking, whether it's in the martial arts. In fact, there's something in Wing Chun, one of the main qualities that a Wing Chun martial artist needs to have is called Yan Geng, which means persistence, perseverance, the power of perseverance. It is a huge factor in the martial arts, and I like to think I carried that over into my writing career. And the project was less discouraging than it was monumental, and just this huge undertaking. But there were some negative aspects to it. Specifically, in order to write the book authentically, your readers, anyone who reads my book, will see that I wrote the book from the killer's point of view towards the end of the book. Once you're clued in on the secret, then I rewrite all the murders from the killer's point of view. And that was a very, very, very tough project for me, because each night I would have to, what I would call, go into Diemschutz's room and sort of get myself into the frame of mind to be able to write horrific lines like, I grabbed her and cut her throat, or I joyously stabbed, things like that were just so alien to me.
Mm-hmm.
But when you read it, you'll see that I wrote from the killer's point of view the way I believe they would have thought of things. So I called the women names that I would never call a woman, but I have them call the women those names. Right. And I felt really bad afterwards. I felt really sort of damaged each time I would go into Diemschutz's room. And I'm a self-confessed mama's boy. Each night I would call my mother. I call my mom every day, and I talk to her. And my mom's a true crime buff, and so I would bounce things off of her because she's been reading these books since she was really young. And I would, sometimes I would appear to her to be really down and out, and she would know, oh, I went into Diemschutz's room tonight, Mom. So the very, very last time I wrote a chapter from Diemschutz's point of view, or I think it was Kozbrodsky's that time. And I said, I got to go in one last time, Ma. There's one thing I need to fix. I got to go into that room just one more time, because I would always come out a little bit damaged. And she says, well, do me a favor, son. I said, what's that, Mom? She says, when you leave, throw a match in there. And so I did. In my mind, I left his room, but before I left, I threw a match in the room and closed the door. And that was the toughest part, and that was the part that required perseverance, because there were some nights I just really didn't want to go in that room. I was even, a little bit scared. I don't know, it sounds funny. I know it sounds kind of wimpy, but sometimes I just didn't want to go in that room.
No, I was going to say, any writer knows that, like, I'll put it to you this way. Any real writer knows that when you write a character, if the character's a good character, he will take on a life of his own. And it's almost like you bring that character to life. And what you had to do was you had to bring that character to life. And did it stink? Yeah, absolutely. But there was a reason why you did that. And honestly, to me, what that sounds like is you had a successful character that you wrote because you really felt him. Because I'll tell you, if you had done a lousy job, you wouldn't have felt as well. You would have been like, oh yeah, I had to write him, no big deal. but the fact that you had to write from his perspective and that you feel guilty for talking like him, to be honest with you, I think that says much about you as a writer. And also it says a lot to you about a person, that you pulled that aspect of your personality out. I'll tell you just a quick heads up on something. I was reading a story about a Jewish man who survived a concentration camp, and he was going to testify before a Nazi guard that had been there. And when he came walking in, he looked over at the guy and he kind of passed out. And when everybody got him up and were waking him up, they're saying like, "Oh, were you remembering something horrific?" And he basically said, "No, I just realized that I could be capable of the same evil that that man was. It is but for the grace of God that I am not." Right. And so that's what basically it sounds like to me, that you experienced the same exact thing.
Maybe a little bit. Of course, not to the extent that that man, nothing that he went through, I couldn't compare. But when you talk about perseverance, probably that was the biggest stumbling block for me, was knowing on a stormy night, snowing, blowing out, snow outside, freezing, dark, and all alone in my big house. And I think I got to go into Deemschitz's room tonight, and I just didn't want to do it. I just did not want to do it. And when I was done, I just didn't. I just felt really bad.
Yeah.
And for reasons that your readers will understand, if they read the chapters, because as we talked about earlier, humanizing the victims, I have a lot of empathy or sympathy for the victims. I can't really have empathy for them because I can't really put myself in their place.
Right.
But I felt really bad about referring to them with the language I used.
Yes.
But I thought it was kind of necessary. It reminds me of something that where I work, where some really, really dirty job had to get done. And the old thing, it's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it.
Yeah.
Well, in a prison, there's a dirty job to do every day, and somebody does have to do it.
Yeah.
And I didn't have to do it, thankfully. It was this little badass instructor of mine that had to do it, a guy called George Wolf. And I realized, there are dirty jobs that have to be done, and perseverance is something you need, as a writer, you need it as a martial artist, and now I'm realizing you need it as a detective, of course, and now I'm realizing you need it as a corrections officer as well.
Right, exactly. Well, all I can say is it was a dirty job, and somebody did it, and that person was you, Randy. I can't even begin to thank you for the time that we had today. I have absolutely thoroughly enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. It's lots of fun. I'll always love to talk about Sherlock. I love to talk about the Ripper case. I love to talk about things, relating to true crime and detective work. That's my first love, that and martial arts. So it's been a pleasure for me, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to be able to get my theory out to some more people, and hopefully some of them will read my work and enjoy it.
Well, I'm going to also say this. Consider this an open door invitation. If you ever want to come and talk about anything with us, know that you always have the opportunity to do that here.
Well, I'm really pleased to know that, and I certainly will take you up on that.
Okay. The other thing that we want to have you, and I'm going to hold you to this, I'm going to completely put you on the spot. You're going to have to come back and talk with us about Barjitsu.
Oh yeah, great, yeah.
Baritsu, is it Baritsu or Barjitsu? I always say
it's both. It's Bartitsu and Baritsu.
Okay.
And there's a reason for the difference, because that being the martial art that Doyle attributes to Holmes, and it featured in my book.
Yeah.
But the original art was known as Bartitsu. It was created by a guy called Barton, who spent some time in Japan and came back to England and created a self-defense system, and he named it Bartitsu, kind of a cross between his name Barton and Jiu-Jitsu.
Nice.
And that was in the news back then, and Doyle took an interest in it and had Holmes learn it. But of course, in very much the same ways we have copyright laws now, and you can't say maybe use Coca-Cola in your novel. He just changed it by removing one letter and called it Baritsu. So in the books, in the Holmes books, you'll see he's doing Baritsu. And of course, in my book, he is learning Wing Chun as well.
Right. Right. Well, you know what? One of these days I'm going to write another Sherlock pastiche, and I'm going to have him learn Kung Randy Fu. So we'll have that. Randy, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us. Oh, and I completely would be remiss if I didn't tell people where they can find your work.
Oh yeah, well, I have a Facebook page for the book, and it's called. The book is, of course, called Sherlock Holmes and the Autumn of Terror, so you probably find it that way. Or you could go on Facebook, and I think the page is called Randy Williams versus Jack the Ripper. So Randy Williams vs Jack the Ripper with no spaces. I think that'll take you there.
Okay.
But I think if you went on Facebook and you search for Sherlock Holmes and the Autumn of Terror, you probably find me.
Right. Yeah, we will definitely have links to all of them. I'll link you to the. I'll have a link for the Amazon book where people can get it. I will have a link for the Facebook page, and I'm also going to massively have a link for the Steph Young interview. And one other thing I'm going to put a link to is the very fascinating animation sequence that you have.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love it if you would do that, because I would love people to see that.
Randy, just thank you so much again. This has just been such a great interview, and I've really enjoyed myself.
It's been a pleasure, man. I'm looking forward to talking to you again.
Okay. And everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being a part of the Sherlock Conversations, and I hope you have a great day.